Hey guys, tonight we step into the cool blue-gray dawn of the Ethiopian highlands, where the air is so thin and clean you can almost hear your own thoughts stretching awake. You push aside a woolen blanket, feeling the crisp stone floor under your feet, and notice how the monastery around you is already humming with the gentlest kind of life. Sandaled footsteps, murmured prayers, a pot lid clinking from the kitchen courtyard. This is the world you've chosen. The unhurried life of a map-making monk in 14th century Ethiopia. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this schedule without at least 3 modern coffees. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd really love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle out of your small cell, rubbing the last bit of sleep from your eyes. The smell of last night's incense still clings to the hallway, mixed with the morning chill and a tiny hint of roasted barley porridge being stirred somewhere out of sight. The corridor bends toward the outer courtyard, where the first beams of sunlight spill across a mosaic of packed earth, shadowed pillars, and distant terraces. You pause there, warming your hands, because even a dedicated mapmaker deserves a brief moment of stillness before plunging into the lines, pigments, and small existential crises over whether that mountain should be drawn slightly more greenish. A mainstream historical fact slips into your thoughts as naturally as the breeze. Ethiopian monasteries of this era really were centers of scholarship and manuscript production, places where geography, theology, and local lore blended into beautifully illuminated maps and chronicles. You are part of that long tradition now, walking those same flagstones with the same mixture of purpose and, did I leave my reed pen soaking overnight again? You make your way toward the scriptorium, feeling the rough texture of the outer wall as you trail your fingers along it. A fellow monk passes by, nodding with a quiet smile, balancing a stack of parchment sheets that look entirely too clean for this hour. You whisper a greeting, though your voice comes out half-croaked, which earns you a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Even monks have off mornings. And just as you're about to enter the work courtyard, you notice a cart rumbling in through the gate, 2 oxen pulling sacks of mineral pigments from a nearby trade settlement. Here comes your first quirky tidbit of the day. One of those sacks contains a deep red pigment made from powdered local iron oxide that the older monks jokingly call the color of too much enthusiasm, because apprentices tend to overuse it and turn entire river valleys suspiciously crimson. Historians still argue whether this pigment preference skewed some medieval Ethiopian maps into looking more dramatic than the geography actually was. But right now, you're just admiring the earthy scents drifting from the sacks, thinking how incredible it is that something dug from the ground will soon shape mountains, borders, and valleys on a map meant to endure for generations. You step into the main courtyard, and already the day feels smoother. Soft chanting filters from the chapel. A line of doves waddles near a water basin. A young novice rushes by, chasing a runaway parchment that has decided to embrace the wind and leave monastic life altogether. You catch the sheet for him and get a breathless, "Thank you, brother," before he sprints off again, disappearing behind a pillar like a very dedicated blur. You breathe in, breathe out, and let the rhythm of the place settle into you. The scriptorium door ahead creaks open with that familiar wooden sigh, welcoming you back to your tools, your quiet labor, and the slow, satisfying art of shaping the world on parchment, one careful stroke at a time. You slip into the scriptorium, and the familiar coolness settles around you like a gentle exhale. The room is still waking up, its long wooden tables strewn with yesterday's efforts, half-mixed pigments, curled scraps of parchment, and one reed pen that looks exactly like a pen you're pretty sure you lost 3 weeks ago. You decide not to question this small miracle. Monks aren't supposed to have existential debates before breakfast. You start by preparing your own little corner, the same space you've claimed for years. The first task is simple: tidy the pigments. You unstop small clay jars, each filled with color that has traveled farther than you ever will.
a deep green that came from copper deposits in the northern highlands, a bright yellow that a traveling merchant swore was sunshine trapped in powder. You did not believe him, but you liked the confidence. A soft blue, made from ground glass, so expensive that you treat it with the reverence usually reserved for relics and honeycakes. While you work, monks shuffle past you, offering soft greetings. One sets down a bundle of fresh reeds for cutting, and another brings a jug of clean water, nodding at you with the solemn pride of someone who managed not to spill any this time. There's a quiet camaraderie in these small gestures. Everyone here knows that map making is 90% precision, 5% prayer, and 5% trying not to sneeze into your own ink. You settle in and roll out a fresh sheet of parchment. It's smooth, but still faintly smells of the hide it once was. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind. Ethiopian scribes in the 14th century often prepared their own parchment, stretching, scraping, and sanding it until it was ready to receive ink. You've done this task enough that your muscles remember the movements long after your thoughts wander somewhere else entirely, like whether porridge would taste better with honey, or whether you should just accept that your handwriting will always lean slightly to the left. You lay out your reed pens, the small knife for trimming their tips, the cups for thinning ink. The sunlight reaches across the table in a thin, warm band, illuminating tiny swirling dust motes that dance like they've shown up early for choir practice. You dip your finger into the red pigment, testing its texture, and immediately regret it because now you've left a fingerprint on your clean parchment. You sigh. A novice hurrying past sees it and bites back a smile. You give him a look that clearly means, "Tell anyone and I'll insist you recopy last night's Psalter," and he scurries away. There's a quirky tidbit you think about often as you work. Some monks believe that certain colors carried specific virtues: greens for renewal, golds for divine favor, blues for spiritual clarity. Whether anyone actually felt more holy while painting with them is unknown, but you will admit that the gold leaf certainly makes you feel more important, even though half of it usually ends up stuck to your fingers. As you begin sketching the day's outlines, gentle guidelines for mountains, river lines, and border arcs, you murmur to yourself, keeping pace with your strokes. Each line is slow and intentional, like tracing the bones of the land. The scriptorium fills with its own soft soundtrack: scratch of pens, the brush of parchment shifting, a monk clearing his throat, a faint clatter as someone drops a jar and whispers a prayer of apology to whoever has to sweep it. Historians still argue whether map rooms like this were strictly geographical workspaces or also quiet hubs for sharing stories, trade rumors, and theological debates. Today, at least, it feels like all of those things. A senior monk stops beside you and mentions, almost casually, that a traveler arrived last night with new information about distant valleys. You nod. This is fuel for your next updates, but that belongs to later. For now, you just breathe into the rhythm of preparation. Dip the pen, test the line, clean the edge, trim the reed, layer the pigments, squint at the parchment like the lines might reveal their secrets if you stare long enough. The room warms slowly, sunlight creeping across the floor. You lose yourself in the work, not rushing, not fussing, just letting the day unfold in its own quiet geometry.
You ease your wrist, roll your shoulders, and lean a little closer to the parchment, ready for the next slow, meditative layer of the day, tracing mountains and myths. The morning light has settled into a steady glow now, warm enough that the pigments soften, but not so warm that anything starts to smudge. Always a danger when your map is basically a very expensive, very judgmental sponge. Your reed pen glides across the parchment as you begin shaping the first mountain range. Each peak rises from a single confident stroke, then softens with tiny feathered lines. You've done this so many times that your hand knows the rhythm the same way your lungs know how to breathe. You carve the highlands, the plateaus, the valleys that wind like threads across the land. And under your breath, you mutter the mainstream historical fact you were taught as a novice. Medieval Ethiopian maps
often blended geography with spiritual symbolism, placing holy sites with the same precision as rivers and ridges. You smile at the memory of your teacher, insisting, if a place shapes the soul, it deserves a place on the map. What makes you chuckle softly is how flexible that rule sometimes became. Which brings you to the fun part, myths. Not the wild, fire-breathing kind your editor monk would faint, but the gentle local legends whispered by travelers. You dip into the soft blue and sketch a tiny lake far to the south. Then, beside it, draw a delicate symbol, a thin spiral. This marks the rumor of singing waters, the quirky tidbit you heard last year from a spice merchant who swore that on clear nights the lake hummed like a choir warming up. No one has confirmed it, and the choir monks insist it's probably just frogs. But the legend has stuck with you, and your map feels emptier without at least acknowledging it. A fellow scribe approaches, balancing a tray of fresh ink and a face full of opinions. He peers over your shoulder and raises an eyebrow. "You're adding the spiral again?" he asks, half amused, half concerned. You shrug, because cartography is 50% accuracy and 50%, listen, the story was charming. Besides, historians still argue whether medieval Ethiopian mapmakers documented folklore because they believed it or simply because stories tended to stick around longer than road markers. You keep working, carefully shading the ridges. The act feels almost musical. Stroke, pause, breathe, stroke. Each peak catches a thin touch of brown-red pigment, giving it a warm, earthy tone. Sometimes you wonder if you should take more creative liberties, maybe give one of the peaks a heroic tilt or a dramatic curve. But then you remember the last time you did that and how 3 monks held an emergency meeting to debate whether mountains were allowed to look too cheerful. You reach for a jar of ink and nearly knock over your water bowl. A tiny gasp escapes you. The novice across the room looks up in terror, as though a single splash might undo the entire cartographic legacy of the monastery. You steady the bowl, nod reassuringly, and offer the kind of slow thumbs up that says, "No disaster today." He relaxes visibly. You resist the urge to wink. As the page fills, the land begins to take form, not as a cold diagram, but as a breathing world. You add the mountain passes known only to seasoned traders, the forest edges where honey gatherers leave offerings, and the canyon ridges carved by rivers long before your monastery existed. You make tiny marginal notes, your handwriting tilting left as always. Steep, dangerously windy. Local herders friendly unless their goats are misbehaving. Your mind wanders briefly to that debate from earlier this year, whether to include the rumored stone bridge far to the east. Some monks insist it's real. Others argue it's metaphorical. One particularly stubborn brother claims it's just a poetic description of a rock formation, and that everyone needs to calm down. You decide to leave it out today. Let future cartographers have their own lively argument. By the time the bells ring for midday prayer, the mountains and myths have woven themselves together into a quiet, balanced landscape. You stretch your fingers, take in the map, and feel that small, steady satisfaction that only comes from shaping the world one line at a time.
You return from the midday prayer feeling lighter, as though your thoughts have been rinsed in cool water. The scriptorium is quieter now. Most monks have drifted to other duties, leaving behind only the soft rustle of parchment and the occasional cough that echoes far louder than it should in a mostly empty room. Perfect conditions for the part of mapmaking that feels like traveling without ever leaving your seat. You settle back at your table, glance at the mountains you shaped earlier, and reach for a small bundle of notes wrapped in twine. These are stories gathered over months, snippets from traveling merchants, scribbles from wandering priests, half-legible recollections from shepherds who swear they've seen valleys that no one else believes exist. Your job isn't to judge their accuracy. It's to listen long enough for patterns to emerge.
And maybe also to laugh quietly when someone claims they found a talking hyena who knew the price of salt in 3 different markets. The first set of notes comes from a tanner who arrived last winter, smelling strongly enough to clear a room, but carrying valuable information about the trade routes north of the monastery. You smooth out the page and begin marking a narrow path along your map, dipping your pen gently so the line stays thin and deliberate. A mainstream historical fact hums in your mind as you work. Ethiopia in the 14th century had an intricate network of land and caravan routes, many of them shaped by terrain, seasonal weather, and political alliances. You sketch the tanner's route carefully, noting where he described steep gullies, unreliable river crossings, and a hilltop shrine painted in bright red clay. You pause, smile, and add a small symbol for that shrine, a square with curled corners, because he insisted it was the best place within 3 days' walk to sit and contemplate your mistakes. You appreciated the honesty. Next, you leaf through a page filled with water stains, the kind that form rings like ghostly fingerprints. This one came from a monk who had traveled as part of a small delegation to a coastal town. Half of his writing is poetic. The sea breathed like a giant animal in its sleep. But the other half includes valuable notes on wind patterns and port locations. You sketch a faint coastline on the edge of your map, letting it curl like a soft whisper across the parchment. Then there's gossip. So much gossip. A merchant had sworn that a valley near the eastern hills held fields of grain that shimmered silver in moonlight. Another claimed there was a village whose houses were carved directly into cliffs, like goats learned architecture. You record the valley, though you leave the shimmering grain as a quiet footnote. The cliff houses? Those you hint at with a tiny set of rectangles along a ridge. After all, quirky tidbits are the spice of cartography. Historians still argue whether medieval mapmakers were collectors of truth or collectors of stories. You suspect it's both. Every tale contributes something, a direction, a distance, a feature, or simply a feeling. And feelings matter when you're drawing a world you may never see with your own eyes. As you work, a soft breeze slips through the window slats, carrying with it the faint smell of roasted barley from the kitchen. Your stomach growls. You ignore it. The map is pulling you into its own kind of journey. The lines you draw start connecting. Routes thread into valleys, valleys into passes, passes into far-off settlements. You're traveling through the land using nothing but ink, stories, and the occasional wild exaggeration. A novice tiptoes in, trying to be invisible, and sets down a small stack of fresh parchment near you. You thank him, and he nods vigorously, then slips away as though he fears any sudden movement might alter the map. You chuckle softly at his caution. If only he knew that the most common map-making disaster isn't cosmic significance, it's a sleepy monk knocking over an ink jar at sunset. The room settles again. You breathe deeply, pen hovering over the parchment, and add the last few notes from a wandering metalworker who once crossed 3 mountain passes for a wedding gift delivery. His directions are oddly specific. Walk until the 3rd banyan tree that looks suspicious, but you interpret them as best you can. By the time you sit back, the map feels richer, more alive. Not perfect, never perfect, but full, woven from hundreds of human footsteps you'll never follow, and dozens of stories that blend truth, memory, and a little theatrical flair.
Dusk slips into the scriptorium with the unhurried grace of someone who knows they're welcome. The light softens, the walls glow amber, and your map, spread across the table like a quiet secret, takes on a warmth it didn't have at noon. This is your favorite time of day, the moment when finishing touches feel less like work and more like a whispered conversation between you and the land you've been shaping. You lean in, adjusting your posture so your back doesn't mimic the curve of the mountain ranges you just drew. The gold leaf sits in a tiny ceramic dish beside you, shimmering faintly even in dim light. You steady your breath, pick up the fine-tipped brush, and begin applying gold to the borders and holy sites. A mainstream historical fact flickers through your thoughts. Ethiopian manuscripts and maps from this era often used gold to highlight sacred places or important political centers, turning even simple geography into something gently radiant. As you dab the first fleck of gold onto the parchment, it glows like a small ember. You smile because few things make you feel as powerful and as terrified as holding a brush dipped in something that costs more than your entire robe. You pause to stretch. Your fingers crack softly, sounding far too dramatic for such a peaceful activity. A monk across the room looks up, startled, then goes back to sorting scrolls. You return to the map, now adding the finer lines, the creeks barely wider than a whisper, the uncertain borderlands marked with dotted strokes. You note them because a wandering trader once insisted the region was either peaceful or cursed, depending on who you ask. You decide to label it simply as unsettled terrain, which feels diplomatic. You reach for a small scrap of parchment filled with notes from earlier debates. One argument stands out. Historians still argue whether a particular valley to the west was inhabited in the 14th century or only used seasonally by herders. After thinking it over, you choose a middle path, adding a symbol that suggests temporary settlement. If future monks disagree, well, let them. You've done your part. As the light continues to dim, you reflect on a quirky tidbit you once overheard. Some scribes claim that finishing a map at dusk brought luck because the world itself is shading in for the night. Whether that's true or not, you enjoy the poetry of it. You add the final gold accent along a river bend, being careful not to breathe too hard. The last thing you want is to gild your own sleeve. The map is nearly done. You sit back, let your eyes soften, and take in the entire landscape. Mountains shaped like folded cloth, valleys winding gently, trade routes stretching like threads pulled taut. It looks serene, almost sleepy, as if the land itself is settling down with you. You run a finger along the parchment edge, grateful for the day's slow rhythm. Outside, the faint sound of evening chants begins. The vibration hums through the stone walls and into your bones. You clean your brushes with reverence, wipe stray gold from your fingers, and place a small weight on the map's corner so it will dry flat through the night. You whisper, "Good work today." Whether you mean the map or yourself remains unclear. When you finally rise, you feel the quiet satisfaction of having shaped something meaningful, one patient line at a time. And now, as the last hints of daylight fade beyond the monastery walls, everything inside the scriptorium grows softer, gentler, almost suspended. The air cools, settling around you like a loosely woven blanket, encouraging your breath to slow just a little, and then a little more. The tools on the table, your reeds, your pigments, the faint shimmer of unused gold, lose their sharp edges and blur into a warm, comforting haze. Even the parchment seems to relax, its once crisp surface now glowing with a quiet, contented warmth. You linger there in the dimness, allowing each sound to stretch out. The distant chant folding into silence, the muted brush of sandals in the hall, the soft, rhythmic hush of wind slipping through the slats. All of it blends together into a slow, steady lull, as if the whole monastery has agreed to breathe in time with you. Your shoulders loosen, your hands grow light. The long day of drawing, mixing, tracing, and listening feels far away now, softened into a memory that doesn't demand anything from you. Your map rests peacefully on the table, a gentle reminder that the world can be explored without rushing, without urgency, simply by sitting still and paying attention. Its curves and colors reflect the care you've given it, and in return, it offers you a kind of stillness, an invitation to drift, to float, to let the last lingering thoughts quiet themselves. So you stand there a moment longer, feeling the evening wrap around you like a slow, warm tide.
And as everything settles, your breath, the room, the day itself, you let yourself ease into that calm, unhurried darkness where rest finds you naturally, effortlessly, quietly.